We're on DAF Chavches Amud Aleph, at the very top in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shokal Adam Basar Keneged HaKlio Keneged HaKoifetz V'Chachamim Omrim Ein Mashgichin B'Chaf Mozenayim Kol Ikar. So the machlokus is based upon the fact that we all know that in the context of BEITZA, we're talking about that while it's permitted on Yantif to acquire meat from the butcher, you can't do it in a way that is mercantile or mundane or weekday in nature. Like you can't do derech chol, the way that you do it during the week. So you can't exchange money. Mm-hmm. And also, the limitation is on how to weigh the meat. You can't weigh it in the normative fashion. So you have to do it in a derech shinoi. So Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to use the typical classic balance scale. You can use that on Yontif, but instead of using the regular weight to weigh the meat, you have to use a butcher's cleaver or some other non-normative utensil on the other side of the balance scale to weigh the meat. The Chachamim say you're not allowed to use the balance scale at all. You'll have to just approximate the meat without weighing it on a scale. So the question that the Gemara now has is, my kol ikar. Why, when the Chachamim say that we disagree, they say that you can't use a scale at all? Why don't you just say v'chachamim osrim? The Chachamim say that it's aser. So the words kol ikar seem to imply even more than meets the eye. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel afilu l'shomer min ha'achbarim. What they're telling you is that not only can you not use the scale for weighing, but you can't even use the scale for storage. Let's say the scale is suspended above the ground, and you want to store your meat there because it'll protect it from mice. Even that you can't do, even if it's not for weighing. So Amar Ravidi Bar Abin V'hu Detalya Betrita. That's only provided. In other words, this halacha that you can't use your scale for storage is only when it's suspended on its peg. In other words, the way that you'd attach the scale to a peg on the wall or suspended from the ceiling to allow it to balance, right? But if it's not in its apparatus, that it can't be used now for weighing, so then you could use it for storage. Va'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel tabach uman asr lishkol basar biyad. Another restriction Shmuel says is that if you have an expert butcher, and the way these experts work is that they're so used to holding pieces of meat, they can hold a weight in one hand and a piece of meat in another hand, and tell you that it's the same weight, because this is what they do for a living. So since that's the way he normally weighs things, you can't buy meat from him that way on Yantiv. So the Amar of Yehuda Amar Shmuel tabach uman asr lishkol basar b'mayim. Another thing that he's not allowed to do is that the Eureka method. Was it our committees?
In principle,
right? Who was learning about water displacement when he was sitting in the bathtub one day, and he sees the water level rising, and he yells "Eureka!" runs out into the street naked. You know that story? So that's how water displacement was discovered. Right? So they used to do this in the ancient world. When you wanted to see how much something weighed, you'd put it in water, in a container of water the container is graduated, and you noted how much the water level rose, and that would tell you how much the object that was placed in the water weighed. So since this guy's an expert at doing that, and that's how he weighs things, you can't do that on Yantif either. Va'amar of Chia bar Ashi asr lasos beis yad bebasar. Another thing you cannot do because it's mundane and it's the weekday activity is that, they didn't have plastic shopping bags in the times of the Gemara. So how did when you went to the butcher to buy a piece of meat, how did you transport it home? The butcher would cut a handle by cutting a little notch in the piece of meat, a slit in the meat, and then you could hold the meat like this and carry it home, right? So you can't do that on Yantif, because that's an uvda dechol. That's a weekday activity. Amar Ravina uviyada shari. But what you are allowed to do is you can bore the hole, the slit in the meat, with your fingers. That's okay. Amar Ravhuna mutter lasos. It's amazing the way we package our meat today. It's so much more hermetically sealed and sterile and stuff like that. It's cleaner. Amar Ravhuna mutter lasos simin bebasar ki hadar Rabba bar Ravhuna mechatech la'atzlas karnasa. What you are allowed to do on Yantif, because this is not done for mercantile purposes, but rather it's done for hashgacha, for kashrus purposes, is that typically, nowadays we have something called the plumba, right? So when you transport meat, kosher meat, you want to have a plumba or chicken to make sure that it's the kosher meat because it's in transit and it's not under hashgacha. So the plumba makes it so that it's not basar shenisale min ha'ayin, creates bread. Is the metal thing? The metal thing. That you need that for kashrus purposes to certify that it's kosher, because if meat is transported without supervision, it's rendered non-kosher. If you put it on a truck without identification seals on it, then as soon as the guy drives off with it, all the chicken is non-kosher. So you're allowed to, on Yantiv, they didn't have plumbers in those days, so what they used to do is they would cut the meat in certain shapes to help you identify it, so that if you sent it with a messenger who wasn't a Jew, then you could guarantee that he's delivering the same piece of meat that left your butcher shop. So that you're allowed to do on Yantiv, and Rabbi Baruch Huna used to cut all his cuts of meat in the shape of a triangle before they would leave his butcher shop, so that people would know this came from Rabbi Baruch Huna's butcher shop. Reb Chia v'Reb Shimon Berebi shoklan mana kineged mana b'yom tov. Now, Reb Chia and Reb Shimon Berebi, they were very close friends. Reb Chia was the Talmud Muvhak of Rebbe, and Reb Shimon was the son of Rebbe. And on Yantif, they would shecht an animal and they would split it with each other. In order to make sure that each one got an equitable portion, they would weigh on a balance scale. They would put one piece of meat on one side of the balance scale and another piece of meat on the other, and that's how they would split up the animal. Okay, so the Gemara now says, but come on, who did they paskin like? This seems to be problematic. Lo Reb Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. It seems that they in doing this they were more liberal than both opinions in our Mishnah. Ika Reb Yehuda Amar Shokol Adam Basar Keneged Aklio Keneged Akoifetz Keneged Akliin Keneged Midi Achrin Alo. Right, the Rabbi Yehuda is only permissive to let you use a balance scale if you're using a non-normative utensil like a cleaver or some other thing. But to measure one piece of meat against another piece of meat, which is much more normative, that's how partners divide up an animal. That doesn't seem to be permitted according to Rabbi Yehuda. Thank you so much, Shmuel. And Ika Rabbanan, and if it's going according to the Rabbanan, thank you so much. Ha'amri ein mashkichin bekaf moznaim kol ikar. And according to the Rabbanan, you can't use a balance scale at all. So what right did they have to do this? So the Gemara answers, Inu David ka Rabbi Yehoshua. There's a third Tana who's not listed in our Mishnah, who's Rabbi Yehoshua, who's more lenient. The Tanya Rabbi Yehoshua Omer Shoklan Mida Keneged Shoklan Mana Keneged Mana B'Yom Tov. He said that you are allowed to measure meat for meat on two sides of the balance scale on Yantif, as long as you don't use the actual weight itself. Amar Rav Yosef halacha ka Rabbi Yehoshua hol utnan bebecharos kavase. And comes along Rav Yosef and says, even though Rabbi Yehoshua was not in our Mishnah, but I can prove to you that we paskin like him, because there's another Mishnah in Maseches Bechoros that goes like Rabbi Yehoshua. Now what's this Mishnah? The Tanan, Psulei hamukdash and hanaasin lahekdish, v'shoklan mana keneged mana b'bechor. Now you need a little background information here. Psulei hamukdashin is a generic term. It means any animal that had been designated as a korban and is no longer usable because it's developed a mum. And there are many different kinds of korbanos that you could designate an animal for. Now, in all of those cases where the animal is no longer usable, it depends on what kind of korban to determine what the fate of this blemished animal is going to be. For a normal korban, like a korban shlamim, let's say kodshim kalam, a normal korban shlamim, if the animal develops a mum and was designated as a shlamim, what do? You sell the animal, and with the proceeds, you purchase another animal that's unblemished. Okay? Now, even though normally that animal no longer has any kedusha, because its kedusha has been transferred onto money, there is residual sanctity that you have to treat that animal with reverence. And the ramification is, you cannot do giza va'avoda. You cannot shear the animal. You cannot work the animal as a beast of burden, but rather you use the animal for its meat. That's the general halacha. When you sell that animal, if you want to sell it, right, in order to determine how much it's worth, you want to make sure that the Beis HaMikdash will fetch the highest price, so that when you purchase the animal in exchange for it, the Beis HaMikdash will get the best quality carbon animal as possible. And so therefore, the Mishnah permits you, since the proceeds are going to a temple carbon, it permits you to sell it in an itliz in the shuk, in the marketplace. However, that's only true, yeah?
You can sell to anybody, right? You can sell to Goy.
Yes, you can sell it to anybody because it's chula now. However, not only that, but you can sell it in the public in a marketplace. There's no restriction on how you sell it because we want to make sure that the Beis HaMikdash will get the highest price for this animal because we need to purchase another animal. In its exchange, we want to make sure that it's the best quality animal. But that's only true when the proceeds of the animal being sold are going to the Beis HaMikdash. What if there's another type of psulei hamukdashin, which is like a bechor? A bechor is a type of korban where it's the firstborn animal. It has to be brought as a korban to the Beis HaMikdash. But if the animal develops a mum, it cannot be brought as a korban, and then the animal then goes to whichever kohen it was presented to. The kohen can just shecht it and eat it. Okay? In that situation, since the animal is not going to the Beis HaMikdash, there's a further restriction on that animal. And that we restrict the method by which you sell that animal. If you as the kohen wanted to sell that animal instead of eating it yourself, we would not allow you to sell it in an itliz. You're restricted in not selling it in a mercantile fashion because that's considered to be a desecration of kudshim that's gratuitous. It's unnecessary. So therefore, even though you'll be selling it in your backyard, right, instead of going to the marketplace to sell it, and therefore you'll get a lower price for the sale of that meat, it's more important for you to treat kudshim with respect, and that's why we don't allow you to sell it. Yeah.
Itlis, what is that mean?
An itlis is the marketplace, the shuk.
And when you do that in the shuk, how do you, a goy comes up and you say, don't shear this animal and don't work with me, you can only eat it?
No, the animal's been slaughtered.
Oh, I see.
The animal's been slaughtered. So, the issue that the Mishnah does allow for is that even though you're restricted in the way that you treat this animal when you're selling it, the Mishnah in Bechoros still allows you to, once you've shechted the animal, if you wanted to weigh it by putting 2 pieces of meat on the balance scale, that's permitted. So says Rav Yosef, you see that this Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yehoshua, that even though there are mercantile restrictions very much akin to Yantif, nevertheless, measuring with using 2 pieces of meat on either side of the balance scale is permitted. And therefore we see that that's how we go like Rabbi Yeshua in Hilchas Yantif as well. So Amar le Abaye v'dil malohi. Abaye says, I think maybe you're comparing apples and oranges. Maybe those 2 cases are not comparable. Ad kan lo kamer Rabbi Yeshua hacha ela deleka bizayin kachim. Aval hasam dika bizayin kachim lo. Maybe Rabbi Yeshua is only lenient on Yantif because there's no kachim involved. But when there's sacrificial meat involved, maybe he'd be more machmir, and he wouldn't allow you to measure meat on either side of the balance scale. Inami atkan lo kami rabbanan hasam, elam yishum de lo mechsi ku'uvdin dechol, aval hacha de mechsi ku'uvdin dechol lo. And alternatively, maybe the chachamim are only lenient in the case of the bechor because you're selling it in a non-normative fashion. When you're selling this meat and measuring each piece of meat with another piece of meat, that's not the normative way of selling meat. But when 2 partners are dividing an animal, which is what Reb Chia and Reb Shimon were doing, then the normative way of dividing it is by putting 1 piece of meat on one side of the scale and another on the other side. And since that's normative, maybe the chachamim who are lenient by the selling of the bechor meat would be more machmir when it comes to dividing an animal on Yantif. So therefore, Abaye says it's apples and oranges. You cannot prove that we pass like Rabbi Yeshua from there. So now the Gemara says, let's go back to the story for a second. You're talking about 2 very dear friends, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon Berebi. And you just told me that they used to divide the animal by carefully measuring piece for piece. Lemember de kapti ahadadi? You mean to tell me that they were so exacting with each other to make sure that each one got a fair portion? Let me show you a story that seems to contradict that. There was once a Maisa where there were 7 fish that were delivered to Rebbe's home. Reb Chia and Reb Shimon, Rebbe's son, are sitting there. Reb Chia and Reb Shimon says, take whatever you like. Reb Chia takes 5 out of the 7 fish home, and he leaves 2 for Rebbe and his household. And Reb Shimon was fine with it. So you see from that story that they weren't exacting with each other. Sometimes Reb Chia took more if he needed more for his house, and sometimes Reb Shimon would take more. So why did they have to divide it up so exacting in this way? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa, Shadi Gavra Beinayu, I Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, I Reb Shimon, Berebi, Bar Kapara. So he says, you know what? You're right. The story could not have occurred with Reb Chia and Reb Shimon because they were so close, they never would have divided things up that way with the scale. So if it was 2 people, it was either Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, or it was Reb Shimon, Berebi, and Bar Kapara. But it clearly was not Reb Chia and Reb Shimon, Berebi. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Okay, so another thing that's an uvda d'chol, like a weekday activity, is sharpening knives on Yantiv. So you can't sharpen knives on Yantiv using a regular sharpener, but what you are allowed to do, when I was a kid, there was an old guy in a truck that would go down the street ringing a bell, and they still have it? Really? Okay, same guy he drove from LA. He's on his way across the coast. It's only taken him about 30 years to get here. Anyway, so Avol Mesi al Gabi Chaverta. But what you are allowed to do, like the Benihana guy, is you're allowed to take the 2 knives and scrape them against each other. And that's permitted on Yantiv. When I use the word Benihana, you know what that means, right? No. They don't have Benihanas here?
They do.
What?
They don't watch TV.
Okay. It's a famous chain of Japanese restaurants where the guy chops up everything in front of you. And so they use the knives. So they would take knives and scrape them against each other. Yeah. Okay.
Raising my children.
So the Gemara now says, I've never been to a Benihana, but of course, but okay. Amar Rav Huna. That's right. Another reason to put me in Chaim. All right. Amar Rav Huna. Lo shanu ela b'mashcheze shel even, avol b'mashcheze shel eitz mutter. So Rav Huna says that the only isser is using a stone sharpener, but using a wooden sharpener is mutter. So, because that's not the optimal method of sharpening a knife. So, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Hada Amar Shel Even Aser Lo Amar Ela Lechadida Avol Lahavir Sham Nunisa Mutter. So, for that Shmuel says that this isser of using a stone sharpener is only for sharpening knives. But let's say I wanted to use a stone sharpener just as a surface for which I can scrape off the grease on the knife. That's okay. So the Gemara says, which by implication means that using a wooden sharpener is mutter even for sharpening the knife. That's perfectly fine.
Wooden sharpener. Does wood ever sharpen metal?
Yes. As a matter of fact, those of you who know the malacha of knife sharpening, you can sharpen knives on leather. You can sharpen knives on very, very finely sanded wood. Yeah. Yeah, as a matter of fact. It just depends. There are different materials that are good for sharpening knives depending upon the degree of sharpness. Ika damasni la seifa, and there are very dense types of wood also, so anyway. Ika damasni la seifa b'shal eitz muter. Others learned that Shmuel's statement was on the second part of Rav Huna's statement, where he said that you're allowed to use a wood sharpener. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Hada Mart b'shal eitz muter lo Amar ela lahavir sham nunisa avol lechadada aser michalta b'shal even afilu lahavir sham nunisa aser. And on that Shmuel says that which Rav Huna said that you're allowed to use a wooden sharpener is not to sharpen it, but rather only to scrape off the grease. Which means that for using a stone sharpener, even to use it to wipe off the grease would be totally usher, according to this version. There are some who say that Shmuel's statement was not a reflection on Rav Huna's distinction between stone and wood sharpeners, but was rather going straight on the Mishnah, which talks about sharpening in general. that the Mishnah had said, Ein mashchizin asasakin b'yomtov, that you cannot sharpen a knife on Yontiv. And on that, Omer Rav Yehuda Omer Shmuel lo shanu ela lechadada aval lahaver shamnu nisa mutter, mechlal v'gabi chaverta afilu lechadada nami mutter. So on that, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that it's only usher to sharpen with a sharpener, but if you wanted to use a sharpener to scrape off the grease, that's fine, which implies that which the Mishnah does permit, which is to scrape knives against each other, is permitted even to sharpen. V'ika damasni la seifa, and some, this is now a fourth version, some say that Shmuel's statement was going on the second part of the Mishnah, which is the permissive part, avol misi al gabi chaverta, that you're allowed to scrape knives against each other. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel lo shano ela lahavir shamnu nisa avol lachadada aser michal de b'mashchezes afilu lahavir shamnu nisa aser. And on that Shmuel says when the Mishnah permits you to scrape knives together, it's only to scrape off the grease, but not to sharpen. And therefore, if he's machmir in the seifa, then that means that when the Mishnah forbids you to put the knife against the sharpener, it's even to scrape off the grease, even if your intention is not to sharpen. So man tana de b'mashchezes aser. So now the question is, who is the author of our Mishnah who says that you're not allowed to use a sharpener to sharpen knives? Amar Rav Chizda de lo Rebbe Yehuda. It must not be like Rebbe Yehuda. And we're going to analyze this machlokus between Rebbe Yehuda and the Chachamim in more detail when we turn the page. The Tnan, Ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbos ela ochel nefesh bilvad. The Mishnah says that the only difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is that on Shabbos all 39 malachas are aser, and on Yom Tov malachas ochel nefesh is mutter. You're allowed to do malacha for the sake of food preparation. Rabbi Yehuda mater af machshirei ochel nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda is even more liberal, and he says even preparatory stages of food preparation, meaning the pre-cooking stages of food prep, are mutter. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be mutter to sharpen a knife on Yom Tov, because that's the preparatory stage for the cooking of the food. You need to sharpen the knife in order to shecht, right? So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if machshirei ochel nefesh are mutter, so then this is going to be mutter as well. Amalei Rav Rav Chizda darshinu mishmach halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav says to Rav Chizda, there's a rumor that is being circulated in your name that you paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So Amalei Yehi Rava dechol kihani mili ma'aliyasa tidrushun mishamoy. So Rav Chizda responded approvingly. He said, halavai, that all good things like this are said in my name. Amar Rav Nechemya berei de Rav Yosef hava keimna kamei de Rava v'hava kema'aver l'sichna l'sakina rather apuma de dikula. So I was once with the Rava on Yantif, and I noticed that he was passing a knife over the edge of a basket. V'amri lei l'chadata kavid mar o lahaver shamnu nisa. And I said to him, Rebbe, are you doing this in order to sharpen the knife or just to scrape off the fat, the grease? So va'amar li lahavir shamnu nisa, v'chazisi l'daite de l'chada de kavid. So his response to me was, I'm doing this to scrape off the fat. But I could tell by looking at his actions and the way that he was moving the knife that he was really doing it to sharpen it. So I inferred from here that ukesaver halacha ve'ein morin kain. It was clear to me, therefore, that the reason why he didn't answer me straight was because he felt that even though the halacha technically is like Rebbe Yehuda, that you're allowed to do machshirei ochel nefesh on Yantif, he didn't want to publicize it. And why didn't he want to publicize it? Because as we're going to see shortly, even though Rebbe Yehuda is lenient, but there's a limitation to his leniency. Rebbe Yehuda will only allow you to do things like sharpening knives if it was impossible for you to do it before Yantif. Because let's say the knife became dull on Yantif itself, or you had an emergency and you didn't have an opportunity to sharpen the knife. But if you could have sharpened it from before Yantif, then even according to Rebbe Yehuda, you don't have a heter to sharpen the knife on Yantif. And therefore Rava felt that by publicizing that you're allowed to sharpen knives on Yantif, people would abuse the halacha and be more lenient even than Rebbe Yehuda would permit. Okay, and now we're going to see it.
But even according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's got to be a point where it stops. Even if you can do it before Yantav, the Makshiri mitzvah can't go back, right?
Well, presumably so, and you'll see Rabbi Yehuda, like I said, places limits on it. How far back you can go, it's not clear from the sugya, right? Harvesting wheat, right, would also probably be usher to Rabbi Yehuda, although we'd have to look and see how far back he goes, you're right. Va'amar Abaye, hava ka'imna kamei demar, v'hava kama'avir sakina asifsa derechaya. Abaye says a similar story. I was once standing before my Rebbe, presumably that's Rabbi, who was Abaye's Rebbe, and he was passing a knife on the edge of a millstone. Va'amrile l'chadada kaboimar o lahavir shamnu nisa. And I asked him, I said, Rebbe, are you doing this to sharpen the knife or to remove the grease? Va'amarli lahavir shamnu nisa. And he told me he's doing it to remove the grease, but but I could tell that he was bluffing. I could tell that he was doing it really to sharpen the knife, and so it must be because he held that you shouldn't publicize the psak. Now, a related question is, are you allowed to show a knife, a shchita knife, to a Talmud Chacham on Yom Tov? The halacha is a shoichet, before he shechts, has to show his knife to a Talmud Chacham to see that it's free from pegimos, from any nicks that would invalidate the shchita. Now, are you allowed to do this on Yom Tov? Rashi says the concern is that by carrying publicly the knife over to a rabbi, it looks like you're doing an act of shchita for mercantile purposes. It's too public of a display of a large scale operation, and therefore maybe it's usher. So Rav Mori berei de Rav Bizna Shari v'Rabbanan Asri. It's a machlokus. Rav Mori says it's okay, but the other rabbis say that it's usher. Rav Yosef Amar Talmud Chacham Ro La'atzmo Umashila La'achem. And Rav Yosef, subscribing to the Rabbanan, says, but you have an eitzah. If there's a Talmud Chacham in the community, what you can do is you can have him have knives in his home. He can examine the knives on Yom Tov and then lend them to other people. That would be all right. V'amar Rav Yosef, Sakin sha'amda muter l'chadada b'yom tov. Rav Yosef also says that if a knife has become dulled, you're allowed to sharpen it on Yom Tov. That we do permit you to do, presumably because we go like Rabbi Yehuda. V'hani mili de paska agavduchka. But that's only provided that it is not so dull that it can't cut at all. Meaning that it has to still be able to cut, just that you put more pressure on it when you cut in order to get it to successfully cut. Now the reason here is like I mentioned before, if you go like Rabbi Yehuda, it's only permitted to sharpen a knife if it wasn't something that you anticipated from before Yom Tov, could have been done before Yom Tov. So let's think about this. How does a knife become dull? It's not like one day it's razor sharp and then 5 minutes later it's totally unusable. It gradually becomes duller and duller with every use. So before Yom Tov, you had a knife, and you thought, because you had just used it recently, that it was pretty sharp. You discover on Yom Tov that it's not as sharp as you thought it was, and therefore you need to sharpen it. So that's the reason why we allow you to sharpen it on Yom Tov, because it's not something that you had anticipated. But if it is so dull on Yom Tov that it mamish can't cut, it can only be used like a butter knife, so then obviously you should have known that before Yom Tov, that you couldn't use this knife to cut with, and therefore you don't have a head to sharpen it on Yom Tov, because you should have known about it before. Now, Dorish Rav Chizda v'itema Rav Yosef, and also, like Rashi additionally points out, that's excessive activity to sharpen a knife so much that it's a butter knife to a razor. Okay, Dorish Rav Chizda v'itema Rav Yosef echad sakin shenifkema ve'echad shpud shenirtzam ve'echad greifas tanur v'kirayim b'yom tov banu lemachlokas Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. So, just to clarify this machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, there are three areas, three practical issues which would arise, which would be a machlokas. One is this knife that has become dull on Yom Tov. Another is if you have a barbecue spit, which normally is sharp on one end to stab the meat through, and let's say that tip breaks off. Can you sharpen a new end to it so that it can be used as a spit? And also the third example would be if you have, let's say, an oven and some of the plaster from the oven ceiling falls down onto the ground, on the ground of the oven, and you want to clear out the debris. That also, all of those issues would be a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim as to whether that's mutter, because those are all machshirei ochel nefesh. They're preparatory to the actual cooking or shchita process. The Tanya ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbos ela oichel nefesh bilvad, and Rabbi Yehuda matiraf machshirei oichel nefesh. And that's the machlokus. The Chachamim say only things that are directly related to the food preparation, and Rabbi Yehuda says the pre-food prep stage is also permitted. My time of the Tanakama. What's the reason of the Tanakama who only permits the actual cooking or the actual shchita, right? So Amar hu levado ye'aseh lachem, because when the Torah permits ochel nefesh activity, it has the word hu, which is a miyut, which means only it, and not hu v'lo machshirav, and not the stages before that. V'Rabbi Yehuda Amar Kra lachem lechol tzarchechem, and Rabbi Yehuda says, but there's another word in the pasuk that says lachem, which means liberally for you, which means anything that you need in order to get food can be done, even the step that's before the immediate stage of ochel nefesh. The Tanakama haksiv lachem. So what's the Tanakama going to do with the word lachem, which seems to open it up? Amar lacha hahu lachem v'lo lenachrim. He says no. That word lachem is coming to exclude cooking for Gentiles on Yantif. That's what the word lachem. You can only do ochel nefesh malacha if it's for you, for a Jewish person, like we've discussed before, but you can't do ochel nefesh malacha for a Gentile. V'idach nami haksiv hu. And what is Rabbi Yehuda going to do with the word hu, which seems to exclude something? Amar lacha ksiv hu ksiv lachem v'lo kasha kan b'machshirin she'efshar la'asos and me'erev Yom Tov kan b'machshirin she'i efshar la'asos and me'erev Yom Tov. So, like we explained, even Rabbi Yehuda, who's the more liberal opinion, does not go so far as to allow you to do anything you want. It's only those things that you did not anticipate before Yom Tov that needed to be done. So let's say, for example, a knife that you thought was sharp, and then you discover on Yom Tov is blunt, or it becomes dull or blemished or nicked on Yom Tov itself, right? Or the barbecue spit tip breaks off on Yom Tov itself. Or you thought you had time to sharpen the knife before Yom Tov, and then an emergency came up and you didn't have time. Only in those cases does Rabbi Yehuda allow you to do machshirei ochel nefesh. But if you had the time and you had the knowledge of that these things needed to be done from before Yom Tov, even Rabbi Yehuda would not permit you to do them on Yom Tov. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel shput shenirtzaf asur l'takno b'Yom Tov. So now there's a related issue, which is a spit where the tip is not broken off, but it's a little bent. So it's not optimal to use it that way, but you could still use it. So that type of spit, we don't allow you to fix it by straightening it out on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Why would we allow you? If it's usable the way it is, you can't fix Kalim on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha da'afal gab demafshit biyadeh. The chiddush is that even though it's a minor kind of fix, that you could fix it with your hands, you don't need a tool, it's still aser. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel shpud shetzalu bo basar aser l'taltalo b'yom tov. Related issue. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, if you have a spit that was used already to barbecue meat, and now it's a dirty spit, you have no more use for it, you're not allowed to handle that on Yom Tov. You simply can't pick it up. It's muktzah now because it's already served its purpose. It no longer has a purpose, so now it's muktzah. You can't handle it. So Rav Malchio Omar Rav Ada Bar Ahava Shamtu Umenicho Bekeren Zavis, and he says no. Even though you're right, it's muktzah. We'll give you a heter to use indirect handling. In other words, a type of shinoi that you'll drag it. You won't pick it up completely, but you'll just drag it and bring it to the corner in order to just make it unobtrusive and not create a nuisance. So Amar Rav Chia Bar Ashi, Amar Rav Huna, v'hu sheyesh alav kizayis basar. But comes along Rav Chia Bar Ashi and says that heter only applies if there's still some meat, an olive size of meat on the spit. But if there's mamish no meat on the spit anymore, so then it's aser.
Can you use your spoon a second time?
I guess maybe you've already had your meal, so you don't need to use it.
Potentially, I mean, you have this potential to use a spoon that maybe you say it's not a muktzah item because I could use it a second time.
Or maybe so I was thinking both things. Either it's not usable because it's dirty, it's gross, or because you've already had your meal, so you have no use for it anymore in Yom Tov. Ravina Omar, Afal Pi She'eno Lav Basar, Mutter L'Taltalo, Midi Dahava Akotz Birshus Arabim. So Ravina is completely makel here, and he says, even if this dirty spit has no meat on it, you're allowed to pick it up without any type of shinoi whatsoever. You know why? Because we have a principle that if you have something that's a nuisance in a public thoroughfare, like a thorn, even though it's muktzah, you're allowed to pick it up and move it straight. It's not a problem. Amar Rav Chinan, and this is like a nuisance in the way, and you want to be able to prevent anyone from harming themselves, so you can move it. Amar Rav Chinan abereda Rav Ika shput shfachos v'gumos Rav Malchio, beloris efer makla ugavina Rav Malchio. We have this quote a few times in Shas. There are two Amoraim. One's name was Rav Malchio, and the other one's name was Rav Malchia. They're not commonly cited in Shas. There are only 6 halachas which these two rabbis share piskei halacha. 3 of them, says Rav Chinana, were said by Rav Malchio, and the other 3 were said by Rav Malchia. Their names are very similar. So as a public service, I'm telling you which 3 were said by Rav Malchio and which 3 were said by Rav Malchia. The 3 that were said by Rav Malchio are number 1, shpud, which is our halacha now, where Rav Malchio says you're limited in how you're allowed to handle a dirty barbecue spit on Yantiv. The next one is shfachos, which is that the Mishnah in Ksubas talks about the amount of work that a husband can coerce his wife to do as far as household chores, depending upon how many maids she has working for her. So Rav Malchio qualifies that statement. And the third one has to do with signs of physical maturity, for a girl who has pores where pubic hair should be but doesn't have hair. So Rav Malchio says that's a sign also of physical maturity of puberty. Now the other three halachos were said by Rav Malchia with an aleph. And what are those 3 halachos? Beloris. There's a problem if you're a Jewish barber. If a guy comes to you with a certain kind of ponytail, which is grown for idolatrous purposes, by you giving him a haircut and snipping the hair that's around that ponytail, you're helping to cultivate that idolatrous hair growth. And so there are limitations as far as how close you can get to that beloris, and that's addressed by Rav Malchia. Efer makla is another restriction from Rav Malchia, who says that you cannot put ash on an injury because it's akin to placing a tattoo, because the ash will absorb into the flesh. And the third thing he talks about is Gevina, where Rav Malchia was discussing in Avodah Zarah why the rabbis instituted a takana to forbid Gentile cheese, Gentile manufactured cheese. So now that we know that, comes along Rav Papa and he says, Masnisunu Masnisa Rav Malchia, Shmaitza Rav Malchio. He says, I disagree. He says, I hold, you say that it's 3 from Rav Malchio and 3 from Rav Malchia. I say no. I say 4 were said by Rav Malchio, and 4 were said by Rav Malchia, and 2 were said by Rav Malchio. And the way that I want to explain it, he says, is that any statement that was made by one of these 2 rabbis that is a commentary on a Mishnah or a Brisa was said by Rav Malchia. And any statement that was made independent of a Mishnah to comment, either make an independent statement or comment on an Amorah statement, was said by Rav Malchio. V'simanech masnisin malkisa. And the way to remember my itemization is that the Mishnah is queen, because the word malkita sounds like malchia. So therefore we know that the Mishnah is the queen, and that tells you that anything having to do with a Mishnah or a Brisa was said by Rav Malchia. My beinayu. So what's the machlokus between Rav Papa and Rav Chinana as far as whether it's Malchio or Malchia? How do you remember which said what? So Ika beinayu shvachos. The case of shvachos, the case in Ksubis, which talks about how much you can make your wife do household chores, depending upon the number of maids that are working in the house, is a statement that was made as a commentary to a Mishnah in Ksuvis. So according to Rav Papa, that was said by Rav Malchiyah, and according to Rav Chinana, that was said by Rav Malchiyo. That's the machlokes, but they both agree that all the other statements are attributed correctly, those to Rav Malchiyo and those to Rav Malchiyah. And with that, we'll conclude. Have a wonderful day.